In Flames has 13 albums, and that fact is both easy and hard to believe at the same time. In Flames has been a metal institute. Ever since I've become a part of this genre as a fan, they have been a group that not only has been present, but has been somewhat on my radar. They weren't one that I initially discovered, but it was very shortly thereafter that I started to hear tales of the legend, which was the melodic death metal / Gothenburg scene, and this group named In Flames that seemed to be right at the forefront of it. Now, of course, In Flames has been the subject of a lot of conversation. Not to mention, they have been harbingers of a lot of criticism, considering the changeover that came in the 2000s and the albums that followed thereafter. Ranking all of these albums might feel like it's going to take on one of the two philosophies that usually come from In Flames fans. There are either those who decide that anything after a certain point is bad, and those that are willing to sort of embrace a little bit of everything. You might be able to tell which side I'm on based off of this list, but this is subjective. So please, tell me what your list is in the comments box below, and let's converse about it. I want to know why you choose yours, and I'll tell you right now why I've chosen mine. Let's rank them all in Flames. And we start with number 13, which is Siren Charms. Now, In Flames has had a couple of questionable albums that we're going to be talking about first off, but this was one that really felt like it was just completely out of character. There were still some of the trademark sounds and signatures of this band that were littered on Siren Charms, but they felt a bit more few and far between. Not that they were trying necessarily to do a lot of invention or reinvention. It was almost like an experiment, like they were trying a couple of things out. But as a result, they fell really flat. And one of the main criticisms that I've had over the past number of years with this group has been the fact that their sound has gone from feeling extraordinary to feeling extraordinarily conventional. Either that or a bit monochrome, a bit black and white, somewhat predictable. And as a result, an album such as Siren Charms really failed and faltered because of this. The same is also true of number 12, which is A Sense of Purpose. Yet another album that actually did try to do a couple of new things, that tried to introduce some differing ideas, and really this is one that just felt like it really missed the mark, mainly because it felt, for all of its experimentation, a little too conventional. Like they weren't willing to go full tilt boogie. If you notice me talking anytime about an experimental album, or an album where a band decides to go and try something completely different, but they don't go full tilt with it, it's not something that becomes an entire album, they just kind of halfway go, that's always something that shows me a group that is too afraid to fully embrace something new, that they have to return to some of their tried and trues. This is an album that showed some, evolution and diversity, but the tried and trues won out and made for an album that felt very weak. Number 11 is Sounds of a Playground Fading. We're getting a little bit better here. This is an album that does have a couple things going for it, but again, some of the similar ideas that were just introduced come to call. This is from a period of the band where a lot of this felt like it was as a result of their takeover and eventual exposure to American audiences thanks to Ozfests and stuff like that around the time of another album that we're going to be speaking about, in fact, very, very soon. And this is just sort of the result of it, that we have albums that start to blend together. Another band that fell victim to this was Lacuna Coil, where their albums seemed to just continuously recycle some of their old ideas and not really present anything new to the fold. It's unfortunate too. I wanted to like this album, but unfortunately that isn't what happened. Number 10 is I the Mask, which is the most recent In Flames release. And despite the fact that it's not going to be present on the Album of the Year list, spoiler alert, this was an album that still showcased the band's willingness to try to embrace things and do things a little bit differently. This was what I like to call a better disc, or an improvement disc. One that showed that this was a band that not only was hearing some of the criticisms, but was perhaps understanding a little bit more about themselves as time has worn on. After all, we are now no longer in that same hotbed period that we were whenever the band was coming over and crossing over and getting a lot more fans. So I the Mask showed a lot of promise, but it just didn't quite get over the hump. But it does give a lot of promise for whatever may come afterward. Number 9 is Soundtrack to Your Escape, which may seem a bit low for some folks, but this is a 2000s album that seemed like it was mainly glaring off the success of other albums such as Reroute to Remain in order to maintain a consistency and relevancy and keep this band going. It's an album that has some trademark moments, and it does feel like it lends itself a little bit more towards some of In Flames' past, but it's one that is firmly also behind the idea of what their future and present was. And again, I can respect the fact that they went full tilt boogie with this, even if I felt it to be a bit derivative. Number 8 is Battles. This was one of the first humps that we've gotten recently that felt like the band was starting to turn a corner, principally because, again, they decided to go a little bit outside the box. I like it whenever this band goes outside the box. It's usually at the very minimum interesting. And Battles was able to do that, and they were also able to hone in on some of their conventions from the 1990s and early 2000s in order to craft an album that felt like it had a little bit more going for it. Did it crack a list? No, it didn't, but it was still an album that felt very acceptable and showed that the band still had some of those old school tricks hidden underneath their sleeves. Number 7 is Come Clarity. Clum Clarity. Again, another 2000s album that was showing that it had those charms about it and was still maintaining itself and was headlong in what In Flames had decided to become. And at this point, if you didn't at least respect that effort, even if you disliked the music, then you were really doing yourself a disservice, considering Come Clarity is able to really showcase some very decent material. And again, it's a band that decided to take on a brand new identity. We just talked about that with some other bands throughout this week. And that's an important thing. If you're going to embrace something new, you might as well embrace it completely. So an album like Come Clarity, perhaps whenever it was released, was seen as a bit of a disappointment to some fans, but in retrospect, whenever I listen to this, I understand, and I have respect for it, considering they did go full tilt. Number 6 is the aforementioned Reroute to Remain. This is a legendary album in the circles of some, considering it was the heralding cry of what In Flames was set to become, although it was something that was already being preached on by albums that came a little bit before it. But still, this was an album that had some great material and still showcased this band as an aggressive melody maker in the melodic death metal scene. And that's great. That melodic side was something that they really honed in on the approach of, and as a result of an album such as Reroute to Remain, we had a lot of bands that wanted to join the melodeath community and would eventually get their fresh start later on in the decade. This one feels like it was more influential than sometimes we are led to believe. Number 5 is Colony. Now, this is a late 90s or maybe the year 2000 album. I honestly forget. I think it's 99. That had all of the exploits that you heard on previous releases by this band, but seemed to be trending toward a little bit more modernization. Some of the things that you were hearing were becoming a bit more polished, a bit more compressed, and had a lot more of a pop to it. The production was much better, and as a result, some of these songs had a lot more density to it and a big feel. And as a result, Colony is a very memorable album, though it may be one of the weaker of the initial couple that this band was able to give us. But Colony also has the real benefit of having a strong lineup of songs and a very smooth track order that makes it a very easy listen. So replayability of this album is certainly something that can be done. As a result, Colony feels very polished, but also feels like it still has a lot of the trademark charms of some of the albums we're about to get to. Number 4 is Lunar Strain, or I like to say Lunar Strain / Subterranean, considering these days that's the effort that you traditionally find, the one that combines the album with the EP. But Lunar Strain is a terrific representation of what this band was about to become. It's a lot more raw, it's a lot more dirty, it is not a perfect album. This is more of a reflection of what melodic death metal was whenever it first started to come into the scene, not to mention some of the interesting ideas and parallels between this band and Dark Tranquillity really expose themselves on this album. And you are going to hear some things that are going to make you think, wait a minute, something doesn't seem quite right. But this is pretty cool, and I love this disc considering, once again, you can go back to this album and hear exactly what this band was set to become. You heard a lot of the ideas that would be explored on the next couple of records, and then you honestly saw why the sound, was such a huge provider of joy for so many in the 1990s and beyond. That was embarrassing. Great album. Number 3 is Clayman. This is the first album of In Flames that I ever got, and I still have a soft spot for it. So, again, subjective list, probably why it's so high. Hey, you just dealt with me sneezing. I probably just blew your eardrums out. You're probably not even hearing this anyway to, pitch a fight. But Clayman's a great disc. This is one that followed up Colony and has a delightful array of songs, most of which were able to emerge on the Tokyo Showdown Live album, which was, again, another one of the first albums of theirs that I got. And it just shows that this band was starting to hone in on some experimentation, but also was slightly starting to transition to some more conventional material. They were honing in on a sound that they really enjoyed, and they were sticking with it. And as a result, an album such as Clayman just has a lot of great songs. It's a very direct approach, and as a result of that, it is here at number 3. But number 2 is the Jester Race. This is a majestic album. This is one that shows melodic death metal at its best and also showed how In Flames was going to influence their very market. This is one that didn't sound quite the same as the At the Gates or even, later era Carcasses, who have sometimes been seen as critical to that scene. This is one that had its individual identity and felt like a band that was really emerging and was taking everybody by surprise with the paramount quality that this album was able to influence, despite it being still very early in their career. This is one I feel that also in retrospect gets a lot of love and attention, especially around the 2000s, whenever the reissue of this album, along with Black Ash Inheritance, came out. It's the one that I actually have, and mine is signed. But as a result, this is a disc that feels like it is just as important to heavy metal history as, Slaughter of the Soul by At the Gates, or, Heartwork by Carcass, or some of the others in the melodic death metal market. It feels like it belongs within that company. But that brings us to number 1. It's a bit of a sentimental pick, but Horacle. I absolutely love this album because this album feels like the band making its effort to expand. And this is a album that whenever you listen to, it just feels like a group that is unsatisfied with just what they were able to accomplish with the Jester Race and wanted to take that idea and magnify it even further. The compositions on this album would showcase the band's ability to slow things down and also embrace a little bit of clean singing from time to time. They introduced a lot of elements that would become parallel and very paramount to what this band would eventually become. And some of the things that you hear on some of those albums that might be lower on the list, or some of the complaining points. This is something that showed and exposed that In Flames was not a one-dimensional act. They instead had more dimensions to them than initially met the eye, or that the Jester Race alone was able to, expose. Instead, this is a band that did something that most bands need to do, and do, but perhaps not to the level of success as In Flames, and that's grow, evolve, and mature. Maturity especially is one word that I would use to describe this album magnificently. There is a big time, high level maturity difference between what we got with the Jester Race and what we got with Horacle. Maybe not necessarily to the ends where some may feel that it's a better album. Again, like I said, this is a sentimental pick. But I still feel that this is the disc where they showcased their greatest utility at growing up. And that's our list. What's yours? Is it in the comments box below yet? If it's not, it should be. Thanks again for watching. My name is coverkillernation. I hope you've enjoyed all the rank 'em alls that you've seen this week, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Take care.